The other problem as well is this issue of disparity between online and offline. I'd like to turn to something that Courtney said about gender parity online. Of course, there is evidence to show that while there might be gender parity online, there isn't necessarily gender parity in the streets. And we've seen that happening in Egypt. We've seen that happening in practically every city. Tahrir Square is often described in a very sort of romanticized way as a place where pluralism and diversity, overwhelmed everything else, overwhelmed sectarianism, overwhelmed sexism, and various other isms. But at the end of the day, there are sort of realities on the ground that need to be dealt with. We're seeing sort of a resurgence of discourses that challenge this romanticized view. And it also points out the fact that there may be a lot of work to be done for these cyber activists to make their arguments and their vision about a future for the Arab world and future for their respective countries more salient, more convincing, more realized. So, for instance, the April 6th movement, as wide-reaching and as significant as it is, the total number of actual active members in the movement prior to January 25th does not exceed 1,500 individuals. And if you were to look at, even El-Baradei's campaign, prior to January 25th, when the objective, the sole objective was to actually collect signatures, petition signatures to amend the Constitution, and they had gathered somewhere or a little over 1 million signatures. 850,000 of those signatures were actually collected with the assistance of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim Brotherhood played a huge role in supporting al-Baradei's campaign. So where is the cyber liberal secular voice, which appears to be so significant online? Where is it on the ground? And can these groups actually take their cyber dissident movement from the internet to the offline realm? And can they reach areas that are considerably unreachable? When I was in Egypt about 10 days ago, I was talking to some of these activists and asking them, what's the biggest challenge given the fact that you have an impending constitutional amendment referendum ahead of you? And the one thing that they all recognized was the fact that there were areas of Egypt that were practically untouched by the revolution. There are some people that still believe that Mubarak is in office. There are some people who could not name who the prime minister was. You tell them, who's Ahmed Nadif? They've never even heard of him. So how do you reach these communities? These communities are reached using more traditional forms of communication. They may be viewers of electronic media. They might have access to satellite television, but some of these arguments are not particularly resonant. So there is a role for cyber activism to play, to catapult, to mobilize, to organize, and the phases actually change depending on circumstances and depending on the period, the sort of the temporal and spatial periods through which revolutions kind of follow. But at the end of the day, before they can actually be called genuine revolutions, cyber revolutions, they have to be able to cross over into a realm that is technically unnatural in sort of in a collectivistic way and in an individualistic way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adel. Thank you. Courtney, why don't you join Adel at the podium and we'll have a Q&A. Thank you both so much for that fascinating overview of new media as a tool for mobilization. I'm sure we have a lot of questions. If people could please identify themselves. I will begin, though, and just ask you both about the downside of dependence on new media as an organizing tool. I wonder if there is too much dependence on a medium that governments can shut down, the internet and even mobile phones. And how do you expect government tactics and strategies to develop in countries like Syria and Saudi Arabia in response to the increased effectiveness of the use of these strategies by protesters or of these mediums?
Well, I think in terms of the state's strategy, there are two strategies. There is the strategy of, okay, we want to control all internet traffic. We want to censor it. We want to filter it, etc. That's the case of Saudi Arabia, Syria, China, Tunisia was that way. And then there are the approaches of countries like Egypt or Dubai, UAE, where they allow some private ownership of internet service providers, but there's an understanding of where the red lines lie, and there's the ability to put pressure. I think that no one really thought that Mubarak would shut off the internet. I think that came as a surprise to everybody. I know I had to go back and revise some of my dissertation. But what was interesting about that is that he incurred a huge financial cost for doing that. I mean, in the billions of dollars. He put his IT outsourcing industry at risk. He put Egypt's entire financial structure at risk by shutting it off, shutting down the stock exchange, et cetera. So that kind of gives a two-part lesson. First, it's incredibly costly to do that, and you have to be basically at the end, it's the last straw that an authoritarian leader can take. On the other hand, it also shows those leaders that it is possible, and if you're willing to incur the costs, I mean, some of these leaders are out there killing people, so shutting down the internet is not going to be a big step for them. And I think that activists have to be very careful with realizing the double-edged nature of social media and internet technology, because it is inherently public. The goal is that they have created and narrated a new public sphere that really hasn't existed. They're citizen activists. They're using citizen media to enact their citizenship. But you can't be an anonymous citizen. So strategies, it's interesting, we see the strategies of anonymity in Egypt, for example, is nearly everyone uses their own real names for the most part. To me, that's incredibly interesting. They're saying, we're willing to take these costs, we have to do this in our own name. But I think that governments are getting increasingly sophisticated at monitoring and tracking those activists. As Adel explained, in the case of setting up parallel Facebook groups or joining Facebook groups, Egypt was a relative latecomer to that. Tunisia was far more on top of that. In Sudan, we saw, for example, a Facebook page being created to call for a protest, and everyone who came there was arrested because it had been created by the government. I have to say I'm a little bit surprised that repressive governments haven't been more activist online, trying to use those medias to entrap and ensnare, but definitely they're using it to surveil. I think that everyone is surprised by the amount of data that was being collected on these cyber activists that came out of the Aman Dawla. There are pictures of stacks of shredded paper, and a colleague of mine has actually gone through and riffled through papers and seen text, voicemail text, SMS records of all the messages sent. So I think that we have to be very careful on the public naturedness. But in many cases, in the case of Wael Abbas or Alat, these very high-profile cyber activists, that publicity provides protection. But if you don't have that level of publicity, it makes you vulnerable.
I'm just going to add a couple of things to what Courtney said. What she's saying is absolutely accurate. In the case of Egypt, for instance, I think the Egyptian government was living in a sort of false state of security. I mean, no pun intended. But what they did was they followed everyone. It was a significant amount of data collection, but they weren't really sure what to do with it. I mean, again, this is a government that was trying to push for increased internet penetration, and on the scale of like whether or not Egyptians are online for uses or gratifications, they believe that most people are on Facebook to have a good time, to communicate and share information, share photos, share videos. But the politicization of the Egyptian cybersphere was something that they looked past. And even though they harassed certain individuals or they followed them, there was one sort of major sentence against a blogger. But for the most part, they didn't go as far as, let's say, the Syrians, who had forced Syrians to go to proxies to be able to access Facebook.